The pressure is building on President Trump, leaks suggesting that there may be evidence linking him to that Trump Tower meeting, which does put him closer to an alleged knowing and willful conspiracy to collude with Russia. Now, tonight I can report there's actually more bad news in here for Trump, but it comes from his own current lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. And before we get into the details, I want to put it like this. Here's how to think about why tonight is so revealing about the mood at the White House, which is quite dark. If you're accused of murder, the best defense is usually denial. I didn't do it. But if that becomes impossible to claim because there's strong public evidence that you did kill someone, then the next defense, typically in law, becomes justification. I did it, but it's not a crime because the killing was in self-defense, for example, and then it's not a crime. Killing a terrorist on 9/11 is not a crime. In fact, it's heroism. Keep those two defenses in mind, denial versus a kind of justification. When you hear Rudy Giuliani's new defense, he's not saying no collusion. Today he's saying collusion's not a crime.
I've been sitting here looking in the federal code trying to find collusion as a crime.
It's not.
Collusion is not a crime. I'm not even know if that's a crime, colluding about Russians.
Okay.
You start analyzing the crime. The hacking is the crime.
Giuliani may not always sound that cogent or coordinated, but look, he is on this media blitz, wall the White House, departs from a past strategy of largely avoiding mentioning Bob Mueller by name. Donald Trump now claiming Bob Mueller has a legal conflict. The White House won't even put out support, though, for that claim.
What's he referring to?
He's referring to a dispute, which I imagine Mueller, I imagine he disclosed it to Rosenstein when he appointed him because it would involve something that actually wasn't settled even to this day.
What is
but that's up to the president and Mueller to describe.
What's the conflict?
I can't tell you.
Are you saying that the business conflict that Mueller and President Trump had, is that about his golf course?
I'm not going to go any further.
He's not going further on that. Now, there were some specifics when Giuliani talked about other alleged meetings before the Trump Tower meeting.
The meeting with the Russians, how can you be sure that the president didn't know beforehand? Or you're saying it's just a he said, he said?
Nobody can be sure of anything. In a situation like this, you have two things that argue against Cohen. It's 2-on-1. I'm sorry, three things. Then you get to the other meeting he says he was at that the president wasn't at. It's 3 or 4-on-1. That's the two. He also has added, or Lanny Davis has added, that there was a meeting 2 days before the meeting took place with Donald Jr., Jared, Manafort, and two others, Gates, and one more person.
And that's a real meeting. You're saying that's
a real meeting on another provable subject in which he would not participate.
If there was a real pre-meeting, it hasn't been discussed in public. Now, hours later, Giuliani says this phantom meeting, if you want to call it that, was investigated recently by two publications, but the meeting never happened.
That was a meeting, an alleged meeting, 3 days before. According to Cohen, or according to the leak, maybe Cohen will withdraw this. I don't know. They haven't pursued it. And the two publications are not going to publish it. I think they found independent contradiction. He says there was a meeting with Donald Jr., with Jared Kushner, with Paul Manafort, with Gates, and possibly two others, in which they, out of the presence of the president, discussed the meeting with the Russians. We checked with their lawyers, the ones we could check with, which were 4 of the 6. That meeting never, ever took place. It didn't happen. It's a figment of his imagination or his lying.
Okay, let's deal with the figments clearly. Giuliani says the only reason he brought up this other meeting, which he says did not happen, is that he wanted to get out in front of a leak. Rudy is saying that Michael Cohen's big secret evidence, if he has it, is actually nothing. You can think of this attack as a kind of argument that Michael Cohen is like Geraldo, and he's going to open this famous vault. But the vault is actually empty, no meeting. So if Giuliani's right that Michael Cohen's big vault of evidence doesn't have anything in it that will actually deal with the probe, well, then we'll see. But Michael Cohen and Lanny Davis are not Geraldo. They're not standing in front of a vault. This whole thing is weird, which is why we're reaching for weird references. How do you accuse someone of going full Geraldo and promising a vault, in this case a meeting, when they haven't done it and there's no vault? I begin with this absurd line of questioning with a very serious panel. Mara Gay, a member of the New York Times editorial board, Shelby Holiday, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Neera Tanden, a former top aide to Hillary Clinton and president and CEO of the Center for American Progress. Shelby, let me start with you. What does it mean when Rudy Giuliani says Michael Cohen might come forward in front of this vault, but the vault's empty, and yet we're at a period in this debate where Michael Cohen hasn't done that?
Well, there's a lot of ways to interpret what Rudy Giuliani is saying. But one thing that's very interesting is in the past, he has come out to try to get ahead of other stories like the Stormy Daniels payment. And it's been his job to sort of leak some information that might be coming out anyway, to do a little bit of damage control for when that information does come out. It's unclear if that's what he's doing here because he's on some networks denying that this alleged meeting ever took place. But on CNN, it was a little more confusing when he seemed to say that this was a meeting and that it would be 4 against 1 or 5 against 1 in terms of, I don't even know whether or not that meeting took place or what was said at the meeting. So he's confusing a lot of people. But another thing that Rudy could be doing is trying to take away some of the leverage that Michael Cohen has if he wants to cooperate with prosecutors. What he has to offer might be taken away by Rudy publicly. And if you look at all the other stories, including leaks about tapes, those have seemed to come from Giuliani and Trump. So it does seem like they're trying to kind of mess with Michael Cohen at this point. They're upset with him. They're disappointed. And quite frankly, they're very scared of him.
Neera?
Yeah, I would have a similar interpretation. I guess I would say overall, what Giuliani is trying to do, it seems to me, is just muddy up the waters as much as possible. So when a bombshell does come out, it sounds like it's a little bit old news to us. Obviously, he contradicted himself a lot today. But I think the fact that he conceded collusion when the president of the United States has been saying there is no collusion is an important fact. I think, look, this is an important criminal investigation, but at the end of the day, the president's lawyer has admitted, at least for a time today, that the president of the United States colluded with the Russians to help win his election. And I know he wants to say that that's the question before Mueller is the criminality. Absolutely. But the fact that the president's lawyer has conceded collusion with the Russians to get himself elected, I think most Americans would see that as a pretty big bombshell in and of itself, and a fact that we should be deeply anxious about the legitimacy of this president.
That's the headline on the screen. If you look up on your news screen and you see Giuliani claims colluding with Russia is not a crime, right? That's a bad thing, whether it's colluding with Russia or Iran or whomever. That's a bad thing that is now being sold as not a crime. And we've done reporting on this show, and I think folks are aware that depending on what the collusion entails, it absolutely can be a crime because an international conspiracy to get a thing of value or to impact a U.S. election is criminal activity. It just depends who knew what when. With that in mind, Neera, as such an experienced person that you are at the nexus of campaigns and media where these things do play out, let's take a listen to why Giuliani says he is the first mover on bringing up the pre-meeting Geraldo safe thing. Take a listen.
Why do I mention it? Because, first of all, I thought it was going to come out. Second, my experience is that when you have stuff like this floating around, it comes out. And I don't want it to come out and be unrebutted when it originally comes out.
Got it.
Part of what we're trying to do here, the jury for this case is the American public.
Neera, given that you are disclosed as an opponent to him, I think I would press you to admit he seems to be telling the truth there about how he views this and his motivations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, throughout this whole long national nightmare of this investigation where the president has seemingly lied regularly, what's obvious is that the Trump legal team is their foremost goal is to indict the prosecution, is to drive opposition to the prosecution, make it impossible for Republicans to act because it's seen through a partisan lens. And it's almost as if they concede on some level that they're guilty, and their goal is just to make it impossible for a jury to convict. And like in a normal trial, what this would be seen as trying to tamper with the jury pool. And I think in some way that is what Giuliani is confessing to. He's trying to throw up as much mud as possible so the American people are confused with whatever Mueller comes out with. And let's just be candid. You do that when you're guilty, not when you're innocent.
You know, I'm struck by something that Rudy said. He said, nobody can be sure of anything. And I think, you know, it sounds almost Putin-esque.
Like, are we even here right now, man? Like,
right.
Is
What
this
is
happening?
Truth? Is there truth?
Right.
There is
Yeah,
no truth.
maybe we're still in class and this is a dream.
Right, exactly.
No, but you're right. That's a Putin
that's
talking
right.
point. That's a very good
I
point.
mean, that's very nefarious. These guys, Rudy Giuliani and the president too, they have a long history of, you know, using New York City tabloids to kind of do the same thing. You fight for, you fight in the public arena. And so what you can't do in the courtroom, you try and do, you know, in the court of public opinion. And I think this is a case where they seem very worried about what's going to happen in the courtroom.
About the real stuff.
That's right. I mean, they can't control that, right? And so they're doing what they do best, which is they do a PR blitz. And they sow enough doubt in the minds of, if not the American people, at least their base, you know, to prevent the political fallout. Because we have to remember there's a legal process here, but when you talk about something like impeachment, for example, that's a political process. It's not a legal one. And I think they are laser focused on that.
So take a
Ari-
one more thing, just while I have Mara, I want you to take a listen to Anthony Scaramucci, who is a pretty loyal Trump aide, but goes quite far in trying to avoid apparently lying, because if you watch this clip closely, it seems like he's of the view that, of course, Trump would have been briefed about the Trump Tower meeting, given everything we know, and so he keeps relying on the word possible. Take a listen.
You really find it credible that Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort would have had this meeting where they were going to get all this dirt allegedly on Hillary Clinton for him to use against her, and they wouldn't have told him about it? That sounds credible to you?
I think, could he have known after the fact? I think that's possible. They do think it's possible. And I think that if you check sources inside the White House and you check sources inside that campaign, the level of freneticism, it is very possible. So, yes, I do think that that's possible. I understand the pushback, why people think it isn't possible.
Whatever one thinks of Anthony Scaramucci, he's a Harvard-trained lawyer who's using the word possible as cover for the fact that he doesn't want to directly lie, and he knows it's not very likely that Donald Trump didn't know. And if he knew, that puts him closer. This is how we got here and why there's a freakout tonight. That puts him, through his own lawyer, Cohen, closer to advanced knowledge of a potential conspiracy.
It's remarkable. I mean, look, we're at a point now where every person in America needs to decide for herself or himself, are you going to believe what's in front of your eyes? Or are you going to see things through partisanship, through tribalism, in some never land? And I think, unfortunately, that's where we've come to. I mean, we don't know what the outcome of the Mueller investigation is yet. And that's fine. Let's let that process play out.
No, we don't.
But we do have other reporting and evidence and indictments that have taken place so far to where we don't need to, you know, believe the president when he calls us a witch hunt. We know that's not the case. So let's just stick to the facts.
There's one other thing about Anthony Scaramucci that's interesting. He came on board right after the Trump Tower meeting was exposed in the media, and there are emails in Senate testimony. There's an email that's allegedly from Scaramucci and his email address to the Russian side, to Rob Goldstone and the Russian side, telling them to hang in there. So there's reason to believe he knows a lot about the Trump Tower meeting and also what happened after that became public. So I think the possible word, as you pointed out, is very important here.
Neera, you wanted to get in?
Yeah, I would just say I think a really important thing for the issue of tribalism is that I think the ground has really shifted in this investigation post the Putin meeting. Before that, I don't think a lot of people really understood how much Donald Trump seemed to be at the beck and call of Putin. We could have facts about this alleged criminality or the alleged conspiracy, but people didn't really understand what the stakes were. And then Donald Trump decided to have a meeting with Putin in which he really did seem to believe Vladimir Putin over our own intelligence forces or intelligence agencies, decided to really defer and seem very weak to Putin. And I think he really demonstrated to people what the quid pro quo situation is here. He's acted guilty in everyone's eyes. And I think if you've seen the polling since that meeting, there's much more support for Mueller. I think even Republicans, not a majority, but a pretty good minority of Republicans think there's something really weird going on. And I think this has dramatically shifted, ironically enough, by Donald Trump's own performance.
Well, you're making a really important point that I'd like you to build on, Neera, which is the problem with conspiracy theories is they require commitment contra the evidence. So over time, even when discredited, they look more and more ridiculous. But even for people who are inclined to give the Trump administration the benefit of the doubt, for whatever reason, procedural due process fairness, which of course is a fun and sexy word to use on the news, or because they love Donald Trump, even if you're inclined to give the benefit of the doubt and say, well, that was 2016, it was a crazy campaign, they were inexperienced, yada, yada, yada. When we're 2018 and he's not so inexperienced, and he has the full benefit of the national security apparatus, and he continues to go in an in-person public forum with the president of Russia, who's known to be a killer, who's known to have human rights abuses, who has been indicted literally now by the Justice Department, and continue to go take that side over the U.S., how does one look at this and say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, there's no support for it? It seems to be going on actively before our eyes.
Absolutely. And let's just point out, if Donald Trump did act improperly with the Russians, obviously Vladimir Putin would know that. And the weird thing about this whole situation is Trump behaves that way. He behaves as if the Russians have information on him. I mean, every political advisor in the world would say, go have a meeting with Putin and act tough with Putin. Defend America with Putin. Defend America's interests. He attacks all our allies, and yet cowers almost cowers in front of Putin. And I think to Americans like living their lives, that behavior was inexplicable, except for the notion that Putin has something on him, or there is something to this story. I mean, he really did prove, in a sense, give evidence in people's minds to believing the whole array of illegal acts in front of us.
Right. Well, listening to you, I feel more informed, but I don't feel better.
Nothing is part of this is going to make you feel better, ever.
It's informational, but not cathartic. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.